Hi, I'm Eris. I once watched a decorated Marine colonel, a man in charge of 130 souls, laugh directly in my 11-year-old daughter's face. We were trapped deep beneath the Arctic ice, suffocating in the dead silence of a failing nuclear submarine, and he thought she was just a frightened little girl playing make-believe. He had no idea that our very last breath, the fate of every single person on that vessel, depended entirely on what she was hearing in that moment. He saw a child. I saw our only hope. Have you ever been dismissed by someone in power, right at the moment you knew you held the only key? Before I tell you exactly what my daughter, Ilara, heard in that reactor's dying hum, a sound that no multi-million-dollar sensor could possibly detect, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and please subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story about a broken machine, it's a story about listening. It's about listening not just to the obvious, but to the quiet truths that people in charge often refuse to hear. Trust me, you're going to want to witness the look on that colonel's face when a child's ear proved his entire team of decorated engineers catastrophically wrong. The tension in the control room of the USS Vigilance was so thick you could taste the metallic fear in the recycled air. The primary reactor had gone offline. Not with a bang, but with a shuddering groan that was followed by the most terrifying sound you can imagine on a submarine. Absolute silence. The emergency batteries were draining, and with them, our oxygen and our heat. Colonel Jackson, the mission commander, was pacing the narrow walkway, his usual stoic authority cracking into a brittle, dangerous impatience. His chief engineer, Davies, a man who spoke about nuclear physics as if he'd personally invented it, was just staring at his consoles, which offered nothing but a series of mocking, green-on-black error messages. They were experts staring into an abyss they couldn't comprehend. And in the middle of it all was Ilara. Officially, she was a civilian liability, a breach of every protocol in the book, only on board because I, her father, and a visiting sonar specialist couldn't leave her behind for this short mission. To the crew, she was a ghost in the corridors, a silent reminder of a world they had left behind. They'd step around her as if she were a piece of misplaced cargo, their faces a mixture of pity and annoyance. Colonel Jackson never even spoke to her, only about her, his voice dripping with disdain when he'd ask me to keep my daughter out of the operational zones. Every dismissive look he gave her felt like a physical blow to me, a deep, burning injustice that I had to swallow down with a thinning air. I was trapped in my own personal hell. I knew Ilara's secret. Since she was a tiny girl, I'd taught her to listen to the world in a way most people can't. For her, a functioning machine wasn't just a tool, it was a symphony. She had a rare gift, a form of synesthesia tied to her hearing, allowing her to perceive the unique sonic signature of every working part. A malfunction wasn't a breakdown. It was a jarringly out-of-tune note in the orchestra. I had seen her diagnose a complex transmission issue in my old truck just by humming the frequency of the vibration. But how could I explain that to these men? How could I tell a hardened colonel that his state-of-the-art nuclear submarine could be saved by a little girl who could hear the problem? My job was to analyze sound waves for the Navy, but the most important sound in the world, my daughter's quiet certainty, was one I was terrified to amplify. The crisis was escalating with every passing minute. This wasn't a simple mechanical failure that a manual could solve. Chief Davies and his team of nuclear-trained engineers had tried everything. They had run every diagnostic, cross-referenced every emergency protocol, and followed every procedure to the letter. They had failed, utterly and completely. Their instruments showed no discernible fault, yet the S9G reactor refused to stabilize. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It had become a predator, pressing in on us. The hull groaned under the immense pressure of the ice pack above, a constant reminder that we were entombed. This wasn't just a machine breaking, it was the collapse of their entire world, a world built on procedure and certainty, and it was taking all 130 of us down with it. It was in that moment, in the suffocating silence following their collective failure, that the true nature of the command structure revealed itself. It wasn't about leadership. It was about the preservation of ego. Colonel Jackson's face was a mask of granite, but his eyes darted towards the depth gauge, a flicker of raw, primal fear that he couldn't quite conceal. He turned on Chief Davies, his voice low and serrated. "Report," he commanded, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence. Davies, a man who usually walked with the swagger of a god among mortals, visibly shrank. "Colonel, all diagnostics are negative. The system shows no faults, but it won't restart. It's impossible. The The word impossible hung in the air, a confession of utter defeat. The experts were blind, and their pride was turning toxic, poisoning the very air we were struggling to breathe. While these decorated men were consumed by their own panic, Ilara was in a different world. She had slipped away from my side and was sitting on the cold deck plating near the entrance to the reactor compartment, her small form barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frozen in fear. Her head was tilted, her eyes were closed, and one small hand was pressed flat against the bulkhead, as if she were feeling the submarine's dying pulse. She looked so serene, so focused, that it was utterly terrifying. To everyone else, she was just a child lost in her own world, a strange little girl disassociating from the horror around us. But I knew better. She wasn't escaping the situation. She was diving right into the heart of it. She was listening to the sickness, trying to understand its language. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pride and terror. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them to just look at her, to see what I saw. But the fear of their ridicule, of their dismissal, was a physical weight holding me down. Just then, Colonel Jackson strode past us, his boots clanging on the metal floor with angry finality. He didn't even look at me. His gaze fell on Ilara, and his lips curled into a sneer of pure contempt. "Thorne," he snapped, his voice echoing in the dead quiet. "Get your daughter out of the passageway. This isn't a nursery." The humiliation was a hot flash that spread across my face. I had to gently pull Ilara away, forcing her to break her concentration, feeling like the worst kind of traitor for making her invisible, just to appease a man who was leading us all to our graves. As I guided her back to my small station, my mind flashed back to her 7th birthday. I'd bought her a complex, beautiful cuckoo clock, an antique from the Black Forest. It stopped working after a week. I spent a whole weekend with tweezers and magnifying glasses, completely stumped. Ilara had just stood beside me, listening. After hours of my frustrated cursing, she tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, the little bird song is too fast. It's making the gears tired." It sounded like childish fantasy, but I was desperate. I found a tiny regulating screw on the clock's air bellows, gave it a quarter turn, and the clock began to tick perfectly. She hadn't seen the problem. She had heard it. She heard the fatigue in the gears. And here, in the belly of this dying metal whale, she was doing it again, and I was too much of a coward to speak. The sharp, piercing screech of an alarm jolted me back to the present. A red light began to flash on the life support panel. "Oxygen levels at 15%, a strained voice announced over the intercom. "Emergency battery power at 9%. The cold was no longer just a nuisance. It was a physical pain seeping into our bones. The engineers, who had been working with a desperate, unified purpose, now started to splinter. I could hear them arguing in hushed, angry tones. Davies was blaming the reactor's manufacturer. His second-in-command was questioning Davies's initial shutdown sequence. They were rats in a trap, turning on each other as the water rose. Colonel Jackson just stood there, his jaw clenched, his entire world of order and procedure collapsing into a black hole of uncertainty right in front of him. That's when I felt a small tug on my uniform sleeve. It was Ilara. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a profound, urgent clarity. "Dad," she whispered, her voice so quiet I could barely hear it over the hum of my own frantic thoughts. "It's not broken. It's out of tune." She looked toward the reactor compartment again. "There's a note. It's wrong. A high, sharp sound underneath the big hum. It's coming from one of the secondary pumps. It's hurting the others, so they all stop singing." She spoke of the billion-dollar reactor as if it were a school choir. The simplicity of her explanation was so pure, so true to who she was, that it cut through my fear. I looked at her, then at the desperate, angry men across the room, and I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Taking a deep breath that felt like swallowing shards of ice, I walked over to Chief Davies. He was staring at a schematic on a flickering screen, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Chief," I started, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. "A question. Have you considered a harmonic imbalance? Maybe from one of the secondary coolant pumps?" Davies didn't even look up from his screen. He let out a short, sharp laugh that was pure acid. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I have a team of the Navy's finest nuclear engineers here. We have run every diagnostic known to man. We do not need acoustic theories from a sonar technician right now. Go back to your station and try not to get in the way." The dismissal was absolute. It wasn't just a no. It was a public execution of my credibility, and with it, any hope I had of saving my daughter. I retreated, the heat of shame burning my neck. Every eye in the control room had been on me, and now they turned away with a mix of pity and relief that the distraction was over. I sat back down at my station, the metal chair cold and unforgiving. I couldn't even look at Alara. I had failed her. I had taken her pure, brilliant observation and offered it up to be sacrificed on the altar of a man's ego, and he had swatted it away like a fly. My training, my doctorate, my entire career was in acoustics, and yet I couldn't make them listen to the most important sound in the universe. The emergency lights flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows that made the cramped space feel like a tomb. The air was getting noticeably thinner, and each breath was a conscious effort, a reminder of the clock ticking down on our lives. She didn't cry or pout. She just looked at me, her expression not one of disappointment in me, but of deep, analytical concern, as if I were another machine she was trying to understand. She tugged my sleeve again, more insistently this time. "Dad, remember the honeybees? In Grandma's garden?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "You said they all hum at the same time to keep the hive warm. But if one bee gets sick, its buzz is wrong, and it makes the other bees confused. The pump is the sick bee." The analogy was so simple, so perfect, it was devastating. She wasn't talking about physics or engineering. She was talking about harmony, about a system in distress. She saw the reactor not as a collection of parts, but as a living colony, and one of its members was singing the wrong song, throwing the entire hive into chaos. Suddenly, a deep, groaning shudder ran through the entire submarine, a violent tremor that threw us against the consoles. A cascade of dust and ice crystals rained down from the ceiling pipes. A young ensign near the navigation console let out a choked cry of fear. The ice pack above us was shifting. It wasn't a static prison. It was a living, moving glacier, and we were just a fragile metal shell caught in its grinding jaws. Colonel Jackson grabbed a handrail to steady himself, his face ashen. "Damage control, report!" he barked, his voice tight, the first real crack in his iron facade. The response came back, shaky but clear. "No hull breach, Colonel, but the pressure is increasing." The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, the silence outside replaced by the terrifying sound of millions of tons of ice groaning right above our heads. It was in that moment of renewed panic that a new figure stepped forward from the shadows of the command deck. Captain Evans. He was the submarine's commander, the ultimate authority on the vessel, while Jackson was the commander of this specific mission. Evans was an older man, quieter, with eyes that had seen more than just training simulations. He had been observing the entire exchange with Davies, his expression unreadable. While Jackson was all sharp edges and loud commands, Evans was a center of calm gravity. He had a reputation for being methodical, for considering every angle, especially the ones others missed. His gaze drifted from the frantic engineers to my station, and for the first time that day, someone in command looked directly at Alara not as a problem, but as a piece of the puzzle they hadn't yet examined. Captain Evans walked over to me, his steps measured and calm, a stark contrast to Jackson's aggressive pacing. He ignored both the colonel and the chief engineer, creating a small, quiet bubble of authority around us. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice low but carrying easily through the tense room, "I overheard your theory. Explain it to me. Assume I'm not an engineer." Hope, sharp and painful, shot through me. I took a shaky breath and tried to translate Alara's bee analogy into something a military man could process. "Captain, my daughter has an extremely rare sensitivity to acoustic resonance. She believes there's a harmonic imbalance, a high-frequency vibration from a secondary system that's causing a cascading shutdown. It's too small for the sensors to detect, but it's throwing the whole reactor out of tune. She can hear it." "This is an absolute farce." Colonel Jackson exploded, stepping forward and violating the space the captain had created. His face was flushed with anger and disbelief. "Captain, with all due respect, we are minutes away from total system failure. Our oxygen is depleting, and you're entertaining this child's fantasy? We have protocols for a reason. We have the world's most advanced diagnostic tools. We are not going to stake the lives of 130 men on the ghost stories of a little girl who thinks a nuclear reactor sings." His words were a volley of pure scorn, aimed not just at me, but at the captain's judgment. The room fell utterly silent, the tension now a razor's edge between the two most powerful men on the submarine. Captain Evans didn't even flinch. He held Jackson's furious gaze for a long moment, his expression unyielding. Then, he slowly turned his head and looked at the main engineering console, where Chief Davies was still staring at a screen full of useless, mocking green text. He looked at the oxygen gauge, its needle sinking deeper into the red. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Alara. She wasn't looking at him with fear or pleading. She was just watching, her small face a mask of quiet, patient certainty. The captain had a choice: follow the rigid procedures that had already failed them, or take a leap into the unknown. He turned back to me, his decision made. "Dr. Thorne," he commanded, his voice ringing with finality. "Take your daughter to the reactor access corridor. Tell her to listen." Colonel Jackson didn't move. He stood there, a statue of pure, seething fury, his knuckles white where he gripped a railing. He looked as if he wanted to physically stop us, to declare the captain unfit for command. But Evans's authority was absolute, and Jackson knew it. The walk to the reactor access corridor was the longest 30 yards of my life. Every crew member we passed stared at us. Their faces were a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and a desperate, flickering hope that was almost more painful to see than their despair. They weren't just looking at a little girl. They were looking at a lottery ticket, a final, impossible chance. I held Alara's hand, her small fingers cool and steady in my sweaty palm. She didn't seem to notice the stares. She was already somewhere else, her focus turned inward, listening to the echoes in her own mind. We reached the bulkhead door to the reactor compartment, a massive, circular hatch of reinforced steel covered in stark, yellow and black warning labels. A single red emergency light above it cast a hellish glow on our faces. Chief Davies and 2 of his junior engineers were already there, their expressions sullen and resentful. They looked like men being forced to attend their own execution. Davies couldn't even look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on the deck plates, his arms crossed tightly against his chest as if to physically ward off the insanity of the situation. Colonel Jackson stood behind us, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight of disapproval. He was a thundercloud waiting to burst, and we were all standing directly underneath it. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and failure. "We need it to be quiet," Alara said, her voice small but clear in the tense space. "Completely quiet." Captain Evans nodded, then turned to the nearest intercom panel. "This is the captain," he announced, his voice steady and commanding, reaching every corner of the dying submarine. "All non-essential systems to be powered down. I want absolute silence throughout the vessel. No movement, no talking. Acknowledge." One by one, the few remaining sounds of the submarine died. The faint hum of ventilation fans, the low crackle of the comms, the distant whir of a gyroscope. The silence that followed was different. It was deeper, heavier, a physical presence that pressed in on your eardrums. It was the sound of 130 men holding their breath, waiting for a miracle or the end. Alara let go of my hand and stepped forward, placing both of her small palms flat against the cold, thick steel of the reactor hatch. She closed her eyes. Her head tilted slightly to the side, just as it had when she was listening to that cuckoo clock all those years ago. It was a posture of such intense concentration that it felt sacred. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to do this, that the pressure was too much. But I knew it wasn't pressure to her. It was just a puzzle, a song that had lost its harmony. The only sounds now were the groaning of the hull under the immense weight of the ice above and the frantic, silent thumping of my own heart. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a lifetime of hope and fear. "This is a goddamn circus!" The voice was a raw, angry tear in the fabric of the silence. Colonel Jackson had finally snapped. He took a step forward, his face contorted in a mask of rage and frustration. "Captain, we are wasting our last reserves of power and oxygen on this sideshow. Davies, get your men ready for a manual restart. We follow the book. We follow procedure." He was pointing at the chief engineer, trying to reassert his authority through sheer force of will, to drag them all back from this precipice of madness. His outburst was a shockwave, and I felt Alara flinch, her small body trembling slightly, as the fragile bubble of her concentration was shattered by his fury. Before I could even react, Captain Evans moved between Jackson and Alara, shielding her with his body. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet authority in his tone was more powerful than any shout. "Colonel," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you will stand down. You will remain silent. Or I will have the master-at-arms escort you to your quarters and confine you there. Your mission is secondary to the survival of this crew. And right now, she is our only variable. Do you understand me? The challenge was absolute." Jackson's jaw worked silently, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying to behold. After a long, charged moment, he gave a jerky, almost imperceptible nod. He had been broken. The command structure had been redrawn right there in the corridor. Ilara didn't seem to have registered the confrontation. Her focus had returned instantly, a testament to her incredible gift. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and when she opened her eyes, they were locked onto a specific point on the massive hatch. She raised a small, trembling finger and pointed. "It's there," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange reverence. "Behind the wall. Not the big pumps. It's a little one. It's making a sound like a tiny, high-pitched mosquito. It's making all the big parts angry." She looked at Chief Davies, whose face had gone completely pale. He stared at the spot she was pointing to, a look of utter, dawning horror on his face. He knew exactly what was behind that section of the wall. It was the housing for the secondary coolant pump's flow regulator. Davies stared at the spot Ilara indicated, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Decades of training, of trusting only his instruments and his manuals, were at war with the stark reality of their situation. He knew what was behind that panel, the TR-47 flow regulator, a component so notoriously stable it was never even included in routine diagnostic checks. It couldn't be the problem. It was impossible. He looked from the hatch to Captain Evans, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes. But the captain's face was resolute. "Chief," Evans commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Open the access panel. Let's hear this mosquito." Two junior engineers, moving like men in a trance, fumbled with the toolkit, their hands shaking as they unlatched the heavy bolts holding the small, square panel in place. The metallic click of the latches echoed like gunshots in the crushing silence. With a final groan, the access panel swung open, revealing a dense, intricate web of polished steel pipes, insulated wiring, and brass fittings, all nestled within the reactor's secondary shielding. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a metallic gut that kept the heart of the submarine alive. Davies took a heavy-duty flashlight from one of the engineers, his own hand now trembling uncontrollably, and aimed the beam inside. There it was, the TR-47 regulator. It looked exactly as it should, pristine and untouched. He ran the beam over every connection, every seal, every gauge. Nothing. Not a single visual anomaly. Not a loose wire. Not a drop of condensation. It was perfect. He lowered the light, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and looked over at Ilara. His expression was one of exhausted despair. It had been a fool's errand. But Ilara hadn't moved. Her eyes were still closed, her head still tilted. She wasn't looking at the machinery. She was listening to its soul. "It's the little silver screw," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "The one on the top with the lock washer. It's making the bad sound. It needs to go left, just a tiny bit, just until the buzzing stops." She didn't open her eyes. She didn't need to. Her entire being was focused on that single, dissonant frequency. Davies's gaze shot back to the regulator. He saw the screw she meant. A tiny, hexagonal calibration screw, factory set and sealed. Tampering with it was grounds for immediate dismissal. It was unthinkable. He grabbed a small, specialized wrench from the kit, his knuckles turning white around the handle. He was about to violate every rule he had ever lived by. He hesitated, the wrench hovering just inches from the screw. He could feel every eye in the corridor on him, feel the weight of 130 lives resting on the tip of that small piece of metal. He could feel Colonel Jackson's stare burning into the back of his neck, a silent, furious judgment. This was career suicide. This was insanity. He looked at Captain Evans, who simply met his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. That was all the permission he needed. The old world of procedure and protocol was dead. This was the new world, a world where the only thing left was a desperate, impossible chance. He took a ragged breath that scraped his dry throat, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear, and fitted the wrench onto the head of the tiny, forbidden screw. He applied the slightest pressure. The movement was almost non-existent, a microscopic shift to the left, less than the width of a human hair. For one agonizing, eternal second, nothing changed. The silence remained, heavy and suffocating. I felt my own hope begin to crumble into dust. Then, it happened. The high-pitched, insidious whine that only Ilara could truly hear, the sound of the sick bee, the mosquito in the machine, it didn't fade out. It simply ceased to exist. It was as if a light had been switched off, and the excruciating, sub-audible tension that had been gripping the entire submarine was instantly released. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of death anymore. It was the silence of a system at peace, a machine holding its breath, waiting for the command to live. A low, deep thrum began almost immediately, a resonant vibration that started in the floor and grew steadily, climbing up through our bones. It was a powerful, beautiful, life-affirming hum, the sound of a perfectly balanced, stable reactor spooling up to operational power. In the control room, a cheer erupted, a raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated relief that echoed faintly down the corridor. A wave of green lights cascaded across the main engineering board, each one a confirmation of success. Then came the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the powerful, whooshing roar of the oxygen scrubbers and ventilation fans kicking in, flooding the stale, dead submarine with the glorious, life-giving noise of breathable air. We were alive. We were going to live. Chief Davies stumbled back from the hatch as if he'd been struck, the wrench falling from his numb fingers and clattering onto the deck. He leaned against the bulkhead, his face a mask of sweat and disbelief, his body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors of shock and relief. He stared at Ilara, his mouth hanging open. He wasn't looking at a child anymore. He was looking at something he couldn't possibly comprehend, a miracle in a small package. Colonel Jackson was frozen in place, a statue of pure, dumbfounded shock. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide and completely blank. The rigid, unshakable world of order, procedure, and absolute authority he had built his entire life upon had just been utterly and completely shattered by the quietest voice on the submarine. In the immediate aftermath, there was no loud celebration. It was a collective, shuddering exhale, a unified release of tension so profound it was almost silent. The returning roar of the life support systems was the sound of a last-minute reprieve from a death sentence. Men, hardened sailors and stoic officers who had faced the abyss with grim resolve, slumped against the bulkheads, some with tears streaming silently down their faces. No one spoke. They just listened to the beautiful, life-giving noise of the machinery. And in the middle of that sacred moment, they all looked at Ilara. They didn't crowd her or touch her. They just stared, their eyes filled with a raw, primal awe that bordered on fear. Colonel Jackson was a ghost, his face a hollow mask of shattered certainty. Chief Davies was on his knees, not in prayer, but in a state of complete intellectual and emotional collapse. He had just witnessed the ghost in the machine, and it was an 11-year-old girl. In the days that followed, as we made our slow, careful way back to the world of light and air, a new legend was born in the steel corridors of the USS Vigilance. Ilara was no longer the civilian nuisance, the awkward ghost in the passageways. She became the tuner. The crew spoke her new name in hushed, reverent tones, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. They would part ways for her as she walked by, offering quiet nods of profound respect. They'd leave small offerings outside our cabin door, a chocolate bar from their rations, a carefully carved wooden whale, a comic book. These weren't gifts for a child. They were tributes to a shaman, an oracle who had communed with the soul of their ship and coaxed it back from the dead. She moved through their world, no longer as an outsider, but as its quiet, enigmatic heart. The most profound moment, however, came 3 days before we surfaced. I found Ilara sitting alone in the mess hall, sketching the submarine's intricate piping system in a notebook, completely absorbed. Colonel Jackson walked in. The room fell silent. He walked directly to our table, his face unreadable, his movements stiff and deliberate. I tensed, ready to shield her from whatever came next. But he didn't speak a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, bronze coin, worn smooth from years of being carried. It was his personal challenge coin, a sacred symbol of identity and mutual respect among warriors. He placed it firmly in Ilara's small hand, closed her fingers over it, held them there for a second, and then turned and walked away without a single word. His pride was too great for an apology, but that single, silent gesture was his absolute surrender. The official recognition was, of course, impossible. You can't write in an after-action report that a billion-dollar nuclear submarine was saved by a child's ear. Careers would end. Reputations would be destroyed. The official log stated that an unforeseen harmonic anomaly was resolved by a creative, non-standard recalibration of the TR-47 regulator. But Captain Evans gave Elara her own, more meaningful reward. He presented her with a laminated card, a mock-up of an official ID that read, Elara Thorne, Chief Acoustic Engineer, All Access. The engineers, led by a humbled and profoundly changed Chief Davies, treated it as law. They would no longer ask about technical specs or readings. Instead, Davies would find her, point towards the reactor compartment, and ask with complete sincerity, "How does she sound to you today, Elara?" It was their new, most trusted diagnostic. The silence from the command echelon on our return was deafening. The official debrief was a masterpiece of military fiction, a carefully constructed narrative designed to protect the system. Colonel Jackson and Chief Davies stood by the official story, their faces like stone, their voices betraying no emotion. My report on the acoustic anomaly was accepted without question, and then buried so deep it would never see the light of day. They had to preserve the illusion of control, the sanctity of procedure. But the truth lived on, not on paper, but in the memories of 130 men. It became a sea story, a whisper in the dark barracks and naval bars, a tale of the time the experts failed, and the world was saved by a little girl who could hear the music of the machines. The official story protected their careers, but the real story protected their souls. That event never left us. It settled deep inside Elara not as a trauma, but as a quiet confirmation of who she was. She never saw what she did as a miracle. She just saw it as listening properly. For me, it shattered my perception of authority forever. I saw firsthand that titles, uniforms, and decades of experience can mean nothing in the face of true, unexplainable talent. The world is full of noise, of arrogant men who believe they are the only ones qualified to speak. But we learned, in the crushing silence beneath the ice, that the most important signals, the ones that can save us all, are often the quietest. They are heard not on a screen or in a manual, but by those brave enough to listen to a different frequency and to trust in the impossible. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening. In the days that followed, as we made our slow, careful way back to the world of light and air, a new legend was born in the steel corridors of the U.S. SAD. Dope Purdue's vigilance. Elara was no longer the civilian nuisance, the awkward ghost in the passageways. She became the tuner. The crew spoke her new name in hushed, reverent tones, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. They would part ways for her as she walked by, offering quiet nods of profound respect. They'd leave small offerings outside our cabin door, a chocolate bar from their rations, a carefully carved wooden whale, a comic book. These weren't gifts for a child. They were tributes to a shaman, an oracle who had communed with the soul of their ship and coaxed it back from the dead. She moved through their world no longer as an outsider, but as its quiet, enigmatic heart. The most profound moment, however, came 3 days before we surfaced. I found Elara sitting alone in the mess hall, sketching the submarine's intricate piping system in a notebook, completely absorbed. Colonel Jackson walked in. The room fell silent. He walked directly to our table, his face unreadable, his movements stiff and deliberate. I tensed, ready to shield her from whatever came next. But he didn't speak a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, bronze coin, worn smooth from years of being carried. It was his personal challenge coin, a sacred symbol of identity and mutual respect among warriors. He placed it firmly in Elara's small hand, closed her fingers over it, held them there for a second, and then turned and walked away without a single word. His pride was too great for an apology, but that single, silent gesture was his absolute surrender. The official recognition was, of course, impossible. You can't write in an after-action report that a billion-dollar nuclear submarine was saved by a child's ear. Careers would end. Reputations would be destroyed. The official log stated that An unforeseen harmonic anomaly was resolved by a creative, non-standard recalibration of the TR-47 regulator. But Captain Evans gave Alara her own, more meaningful reward. He presented her with a laminated card, a mock-up of an official ID, that read, Alara Thorne, Chief Acoustic Engineer, All Access. The engineers, led by a humbled and profoundly changed Chief Davies, treated it as law. They would no longer ask about technical specs or readings. Instead, Davies would find her, point towards the reactor compartment, and ask with complete sincerity, "How does she sound to you today, Alara?" It was their new, most trusted diagnostic. That event never left us. It settled deep inside Alara, not as a trauma, but as a quiet confirmation of who she was. She never saw what she did as a miracle. She just saw it as listening properly. For me, it shattered my perception of authority forever. I saw firsthand that titles, uniforms, and decades of experience can mean nothing in the face of true, unexplainable talent. The world is full of noise, of arrogant men who believe they are the only ones qualified to speak. But we learned, in the crushing silence beneath the ice, that the most important signals, the ones that can save us all, are often the quietest. They are heard not on a screen or in a manual, but by those brave enough to listen to a different frequency and to trust in the impossible. The real lesson wasn't just about a submarine. It was about learning to hear the value in voices the world tries to silence. It's about trusting that quiet intuition in yourself or in someone you love, even when every expert and every rule tells you you're crazy. We all have moments where we know the answer, but are afraid to speak up against the loud, confident voices of authority. That day taught me that courage isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about honoring the quietest truth, especially when it's your own. It's about recognizing that the most powerful force isn't always a machine, but the simple conviction of someone who was never told their gift was impossible. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-trust, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. Thank you for listening.